Hello and welcome to Brain Booster, a YouTube channel dedicated to exploring and explaining the world's most fascinating and complex topics. Today, we're diving into the history of Cuba, a country that has gone through a great deal of changes, both politically and economically. Join us as we take a closer look at the events that shaped Cuba into the nation it is today. Cuba before Fidel Castro's revolution was primarily an agricultural-based economy, with sugar being the main source of income. The country was also heavily influenced by the United States, with U.S. investments controlling much of the island's assets. The story of modern Cuba is a complex one, starting with the rise of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. However, things changed when Fidel Castro led a guerrilla warfare campaign against the government and rose to power. Initially, the Cuban Communist Party was not supportive of Castro's efforts, and the coalition that helped him come to power was overwhelmingly social, democratic, and anti-communist. Fidel Castro hid his true ideological aspirations, but once in power, his communist leanings became more apparent. In just 9 months, he enacted sweeping reforms, including agrarian reforms, raising wages, lowering rents, nationalizing various industries, and signing a trade partnership with the Soviet Union. In addition, it meant that the United States' huge investments were now controlled and owned by the Cuban government. This caused a rift between Cuba and the United States, leading to a complete embargo on Cuban goods and the U.S. cutting the sugar quota. The early socialist period in Cuba proved to be a failure, with the accumulation of productive assets given priority over consumer products and the spending and investment being haphazard and inefficient. Despite some successes in education and healthcare, the economy contracted and was only kept afloat by generous loans and trade deals with the Soviet Union. However, by the 1970s, Cuba had transitioned to a planned economic structure with the help of Soviet and Czech experts, leading to an impressive economic growth spur. This growth was fueled by the Soviet Union, but with its collapse in 1991, Cuba lost 35% of its entire economy and 80% of its international trade. This led to major food shortages, blackouts, and a desperate situation for the Cuban people. To survive, Cuba transformed into a dual economy, with a state-run centrally planned economy and a limited private sector. The reforms that enabled the regime to survive, including dollarization of the economy and the legalization of foreign investment, led to a rebound in the economy, with tourism and the export of medical professionals becoming the lifeline. However, by the late 2000s, the Cuban economy started to worsen, with declining sugar prices and a reliance on Venezuela for oil. Raúl Castro was forced to institute new reforms, but they did little to change the underlying structure of the economy and only served as a band-aid solution. The current economic situation in Cuba remains dire, with the government cooking the numbers of its economy instead of undertaking the structural reforms needed to improve the lives of its people. The future remains uncertain, with ad hoc minor reforms aimed at avoiding economic meltdown while maintaining political power. The Cuban people will continue to face unnecessary hardship, food shortages, and a future devoid of much opportunity. Cuba has a rich and complex economic history, marked by significant events and reforms that have shaped its current state. From the initial nationalizations and reforms under Fidel Castro to the legalization of the US dollar and enticement of foreign investment, each step has had a lasting impact on the Cuban economy. However, despite these efforts, the economy has remained stagnant, with the government unable to undertake the necessary structural reforms. This has resulted in a dual economy with a small, thriving private sector coexisting alongside a state-run, centrally planned economy that struggles to provide for its citizens. So why has the Cuban economy remained stagnant? As we take a look back at the early years of Cuba's history, we can see a nation that was rapidly growing and changing. The country was a hub of activity, with thriving casinos and luxurious hotels that attracted visitors from all over the world. However, beneath the glitz and glamour, there was a much darker reality. The rise of casinos and hotels in Cuba was accompanied by the growth of slums in the countryside. Many of the workers who built the casinos and hotels lived in these slums, working long hours for very little pay. Despite the wealth and prosperity that was evident in Havana, the rest of the country was struggling to keep up. The early years of Cuba's history were marked by stark contrasts, with the rich living a life of luxury while the poor struggled to make ends meet. The Great Depression had a significant impact on Cuba's economy in the early 20th century. The collapse of the global economy caused a drastic drop in demand for sugar, the cornerstone of the Cuban economy. As a result, unemployment skyrocketed, and poverty became widespread. The Cuban government, unable to provide for its people, resorted to borrowing from the United States, leading to further dependence on their northern neighbor. Despite these challenges, Cuba managed to recover somewhat during World War II, as the demand for sugar increased once again. But this was short-lived, as the post-war years brought new economic struggles to the island nation. In the late 1950s, Fidel Castro rose to power in Cuba, promising to bring about change and end corruption. His revolution was initially popular, but soon the reality of his socialist policies became clear. Castro immediately seized and nationalized the refineries, prompting the United States to respond with a cut to the sugar quota, which was the cornerstone of the Cuban economy. The U.S. would go on to carry out counter-Castro operations for decades, including an embargo on Cuban goods and supporting insurgency groups. This almost entirely shut off Cuba from trade with the Western world, forcing them into the hands of the Soviet Union. When Castro announced that the Cuban Revolution was a socialist one, successive rounds of nationalizations brought all private operations under the direct control of the state. The state would set prices for every good, wage differences were reduced, and the system tried to use moral incentives. However, this early socialist period in Cuba was a failure, with bottlenecks appearing across the economy, overemployment, and a contracting economy. By the 1970s, Cuba joined the Soviet-led economic alliance and transitioned to a planned economic structure, which improved the allocation of investments and increased worker productivity. Cuba's economy grew, with successes in education and healthcare, but became solely reliant upon sugar exports and subsidies and aid from the Soviet Union. Fidel Castro's rise to power led to the nationalization of private enterprises, as he saw this as a way to gain control over the economy and improve the lives of the Cuban people. In the early years of the revolution, everything from street vendors, retail stores, bars, grocery stores, banks, and sugar mills were owned and operated solely by the government. The state set prices for every good demanded and industries were told exactly what and how much to produce. Despite the good intentions, the system proved to be a failure, with bottlenecks appearing across the entire economy, overemployment, and a lack of motivation in the workforce. However, Cuba would eventually join the Soviet-led economic alliance known as Comecon and begin its transition to a true planned economic structure, which led to an impressive economic growth spur. The Soviet Union provided Cuba with a large portion of its imports, and this relationship was key to keeping the Cuban economy afloat. Cuba entered the Soviet-led economic alliance, known as Comecon, in the 1970s. This cemented Cuba as a nation that was wholly dependent upon a single crop, sugar, and the Soviet Union. With the help of Soviet and Czech experts, Cuba's economy improved, bottlenecks were decreased, and the allocation of investments was improved. The sugar industry was mechanized, and the Soviets started supplying Cuba with even more generous trade deals for oil, machinery, and consumer goods. The Cuban economy entered its communist golden age, and shortages were lessened, while access to healthcare and education remained high, of good quality, and free due to persistent emphasis and resource allocation towards them. However, the foundations of the system started to show cracks by the 1980s, and its over-reliance on trading sugar for cheap imports was significantly weakened by slumping global prices. Cuba's entry into the Soviet-led economic alliance brought with it an impressive economic growth spur, with the sugar industry being one of the main beneficiaries. The sugar industry was modernized and mechanized, with the Soviets providing generous trade deals for oil, machinery, and consumer goods. This resulted in a boost in output and a more efficient process, becoming a cornerstone of the Cuban economy. However, the over-reliance on trading sugar for cheap imports would prove to be a weakness in the future. Despite the difficulties faced by the Cuban economy during this time, the government continued to place a strong emphasis on healthcare and education. As a result, the population became more educated and literate, and had good access to social safety nets and healthcare. The government allocated resources towards these sectors, and it paid off as they continued to provide high-quality and free healthcare and education services to the people. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1990 had a devastating impact on Cuba. The island nation lost its main trading partner and source of subsidies, resulting in a 35% contraction of its economy and 80% reduction in international trade. The loss of oil, which the Soviet Union had supplied 100% of, caused blackouts and shut down industries. The average Cuban lost weight, and there were up to 40,000 cases of nutritional deficiencies causing blindness. Despite the difficult circumstances, the government tried to avoid an economic meltdown by creating a dual economy and legalizing the use of the US dollar. The legalization of foreign investment and the expansion of tourism helped revive the economy, but it also created a new class system where those in the tourist industry were paid much more than doctors and teachers. The government's reliance on exporting doctors abroad for income also became a significant factor in the economy. Despite these measures, the Cuban economy remained stagnant and heavily reliant on external factors. The country faced major food shortages, blackouts became the norm, and industries stopped being able to produce much of anything. Fidel Castro, who had held power for almost 50 years, likened the situation to a deal with the devil. In order for his regime and socialism to survive, he had to figure out a way to operate in a world devoid of strong socialist trading partners. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a devastating blow to Cuba, which had become reliant on the communist superpower for trade and subsidies. The sudden loss of 70% of its trucks, 91% of its fertilizer, 70% of its iron, 74% of its grain, and 100% of its oil led to widespread shortages and economic contraction. To survive, the Cuban government had to create a dual economy, with a limited private sector and state-run enterprises allowed to engage in profit-seeking ventures with foreign currencies. The economy was dollarized, and foreign investment in tourism was legalized and actively encouraged. Tourism became the lifeline for the Cuban economy, generating $2 billion a year and allowing the economy to grow again. However, this growth came at a cost, as the reforms created a new class of haves and have-nots, with those in the state-run economy struggling to make ends meet while those in the private sector thrived. Cuba's economy was given a lifeline in the 90s when it dollarized its economy and legalized foreign investment, specifically in the tourism industry. This move proved to be wildly successful, as the number of tourists visiting Cuba exploded from 340,000 in 1990 to almost 2 million by the year 2000. Tourism became a major source of income for the Cuban economy, generating $2 billion a year. When it comes to attracting tourists, Cuba has a lot to offer. From its rich culture and history, to its world-famous cigars and rum, there are a multitude of factors that make Cuba a desirable destination for travelers. One of the most attractive elements of Cuba is its culture. Visitors can experience the island's music, dance, and art, and get a taste of the country's unique and vibrant way of life. Another factor that draws tourists to Cuba is its cigars. The country is well known for producing some of the best cigars in the world, and visitors can tour cigar factories, watch the rolling process, and purchase cigars to take home as souvenirs. Cuban rum is another popular attraction for tourists. The island has a long history of producing high-quality rum, and visitors can sample the different varieties and learn about the rum-making process. In addition to its rich culture and famous products, Cuba is also known for its festivals and entertainment. Visitors can experience the island's traditional music and dance, attend cultural events, and enjoy the lively atmosphere that makes Cuba such a unique and memorable place to visit. However, this success also created a new class divide in Cuba, with those in the service industry receiving tips in dollars while others were paid in pesos. This caused tension and hardship for many Cubans, as they struggled to find food and basic necessities while tourists enjoyed the luxuries of their country. The rebound of the tourism industry was a significant event in Cuba's post-Soviet era. The legalization and active enticement of foreign investment, specifically in the expansion of tourism, helped the Cuban economy recover. The new hotels that sprang up, the restoration of old ones, and the appearance of restaurants and nightclubs in Havana transformed the city into a tourist hub. This lifeline for the Cuban economy allowed it to grow and recover from the devastating effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent loss of oil subsidies, Cuba was forced to find new sources of income. The island nation found a solution in its highly trained medical professionals. By shipping tens of thousands of doctors abroad, Cuba was able to generate 46% of its export earnings. Cuban doctors are in high demand due to their reputation for excellent training and quality care. They work in countries all over the world, including Venezuela, Angola, and Brazil. This has become a major source of income for Cuba, as it continues to struggle to rebuild its economy. Despite efforts to institute new reforms by Raúl Castro in 2013, the Cuban economy has remained stagnant due to the government's inability to undertake the necessary structural reforms. The Cuban people continue to face food shortages and a future devoid of opportunities for their children. The stark contrast between the lives of the average Cuban and the lives of tourists who visit the island only highlights the need for change. The government's reliance on the export of doctors and subsidized oil from Venezuela has kept the economy from collapsing, but it has not provided the fundamental changes needed for long-term growth. The Cuban economy remains in a state of flux, with only minor reforms being implemented to avoid economic meltdown, but not to significantly improve the lives of its people. Despite numerous attempts by the government to institute reforms, these changes have been nothing more than band-aid solutions to the underlying issues plaguing the Cuban economy. Instead of implementing real change that would improve the lives of the Cuban people, these ad hoc reforms have only been implemented to avoid economic meltdown while maintaining the government's political power. The Cuban government's inability to undertake the necessary structural reforms has left the economy stagnant and the people suffering. Food shortages, limited opportunities, and a bleak future for their children remain constant challenges for the Cuban people. The future of Cuba's economy remains uncertain. Despite minor reforms, the government has yet to undertake the structural changes that are needed to truly improve the economy and the lives of the Cuban people. The continued reliance on exports, particularly in the form of doctors, and subsidized oil from Venezuela will only provide temporary relief. The lack of economic freedoms and the inability to undertake real reforms will likely result in continued hardships for the Cuban people. The future of Cuba's economy remains dependent on the government's willingness to undertake significant reforms and allow for a more open and dynamic economy. In this documentary, we took a deep dive into the rich and complex history of Cuba's economy. We explored the early years of Cuba's rise as a hub for casinos and slums, and the impact of the Great Depression on the island nation. We saw how Fidel Castro's rise to power and the nationalization of private enterprises set the stage for Cuba's entry into the Soviet-led economic alliance, leading to a communist golden age of mechanized sugar production and improved healthcare and education. However, this period of growth was not without its challenges, as the system began to show cracks and the collapse of the Soviet Union left Cuba's economy in shambles. Despite efforts to dollarize the economy and legalize foreign investment, particularly in the tourism industry, the Cuban economy remains stagnant due to the government's inability to undertake meaningful reforms. The Cuban people continue to face hardships, such as food shortages and limited opportunities for their children, as a result of this inability to reform. We would like to thank you for staying with us until the end of this documentary on Cuba's economic history. We hope that you have gained valuable insights and a deeper understanding of the challenges and complexities that Cuba has faced and continues to face. We encourage you to further your research on this subject and to raise awareness about the current state of Cuba's economy. If you found this video informative and educational, please consider subscribing to our channel and watching our other videos. Your support helps us create more content that can inspire and educate people about important topics. Thank you for watching.